Hello, and welcome back to Literally Literary. If this is your first time joining us, be sure to check out our previous episodes. This episode, we will be continuing our discussion on A Ballad of Love and Glory by Reyna Grande. In this episode, we will be focusing on parts 2 through 4.
By the way, shout out to Words on a Wire. We were able to check out. Did we give them a shout out the first episode? I can't remember.
We kind of did, yeah.
Okay.
But we hadn't listened to the episode yet, and so yeah, shout out to Daniel Chacon for getting to interview Reyna Grande and talking about this book, and we enjoyed what they were able to discuss because there was a lot about her process. Her writing process, which a lot of times you don't get, with interviews, and maybe it's just me, the way I interview, but I'm always wanting to ask specific questions about pieces or like characters or plot things or whatever, but
which is what we do.
Yeah. So I think that's probably why I'm like, I kind of enjoyed his interviewing style because he was just like platicando with a friend, or it seemed that way.
I could definitely tell, they're familiar, and
yeah.
Grande, she's a multiple award winner, author. It was a good. So if you guys check it out, definitely encourage you to do it. You can find it on Spotify. Words on a Wire. We got to give a shout out to our literary world peeps, in the area, I think. And like you said, insight. But even in the second half, like there were still questions, even though we got insight into, Reyna Grande's writing, like kind of the research that she did for this. And a lot of what influenced her characters, like Jimena, and including the grandmother, and the way she kind of uses kind of her own background, right, as kind of fill-in for these characters. Was all pretty fascinating. And at the same time, as we were reading this, we had some interesting questions about, like, again, as someone writing historical fiction, how do you like write about these things that happen, right? And this is going to come up today's episode, right? Like decisions and
like decisions that the characters are making and the decisions that the author's making, because she's trying to keep it real, and she put so much work research wise, and on that podcast she was saying how she read everything, not just historical books and biographies, memoirs, but books about like cockfights and stuff like that, which I thought was really cool. Like, really, wow! Like she was just reading everything to kind of create this whole world, and then she creates this book out of that. So there is a lot of historical fact, but it's still a fictional novel. Yeah. So and we don't know what parts are, fact. I mean, I think what we can figure to be factual are like the dates and the names and things like that. But there are some parts where we're like, this was kind of weird. I wonder if this really happened, or this seems a little out of character. So we can talk about that later. But
right, historical fiction is so interesting in that way. And not that it's a historical romance, and we did talk a little bit of romance the first episode, right?
Yeah, and how I've been on a romance binge apparently.
Yeah, do you want to mention that really quick? I think it's a pretty good segue. I think
no,
a lot of. I think a lot of our lives have been kind of intersecting in different ways out of this book that we're still. Because I was talking about my recent fascination with like music in Texas. So like, I don't know, you want to start?
Oh, okay. So you're gonna. I was going to talk about Bridgerton, but you want to talk about the Hano music.
That's what I mean. No, yes. But like the romance.
Because we were talking about a lot of different things. Yeah, so I've been watching
show before the show.
Bridgerton. And listeners, those of you who watch that show or have heard of it or have seen the memes, it's like a classic like romance, historical kind of romantic genre. And I think I was so fascinated with it now because I've been reading this book at the same time. And I did watch the first season and I was like, okay, this is super cheesy, but it's entertaining in the way that, this is what you expect of the show. not something that I'd be like, oh my God, you guys, you have to watch Bridgerton. But if you
I hear it's
if you have
binge-worthy.
time,
It's meme-worthy. apparently.
it's very meme worthy.
Okay.
But yeah, I think that it really helped to read this book, and not to take anything away from Reyna Grande and like all the work that she put into this, because Bridgerton is just like, queso. It's just cheese.
I had never heard of it, so the first thing I asked, what's Bridgerton? it's
Don't worry about it.
just okay.
But yeah, it's kind of ridiculous in all the great ways, like what you expect out of like the Harlequin romances and like, the star-crossed lovers and stuff like that. So it has a lot of those same tropes that we talked about in episode 1. But it really exaggerates them in the ways that I think actual romance novels do. And again, I don't know enough about it to be like, this is what they do and what they don't do, but this is what I think they do. And what I've been exposed to with the romance genre. But then again, I've only watched shows or watched rom-coms and stuff. So that's my extent of knowledge when it comes to the romance genre up until now.
So, I mean, I think that's great. I mean, I think we also, I don't know if we touched on it, but so there's the literal romance. But I think sometimes in literature, when we speak of romance, it's not necessarily like having to do with romantic though. Because I think, philosophically, romanticism kind of like out of the German tradition, has a lot to do with like nature and, kind of like focusing on the sublimity of it all. And I think sometimes in literature, when we talk about romance, we're also talking about like an adventure, a journey. And this is very much one of that as well. And again, speaking of the history, kind of talking about what I was going to mention. And the fact is, when we read stuff, we apply it to things going on in our everyday lives, right? So from the shows that we watched, even music, right now, in our podcast room, we have some new neighbors, and they're at the Tejano radio station. So I was trying to like take into account, like, well, okay, I mean, I know the music, but like, what do I know? And this kind of brought up like ethnomusicology. Such a fascinating subject. How the people in regions and in cultures shape and influence music. And so, of course, Tejano music, you speak of Texas, right now we're reading a very distinct moment in Texas history. And, I think of norteño, which borrows influences from German music, from all the German immigrants bringing their accordions in and the development of norteño music and banda, and we're talking about cumbia. So it's all really fascinating, I think, reading this book, kind of opening lens and everything else coming around us. Anyway, I know we can actually get into the book now, but I just it ties in though.
It does tie in, yeah, I think so.
So, Vanessa, what about you? What do you think about any tie-ins based on just like casually, in your own life?
In my own life? Dang. Well, when we were reading the other day, I played a song called Drink Before the War.
That's right.
And we kind of thought it went really well with the book. I also thought a lot about The Notebook and Mexican Gothic.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And so, again, going back to the romance, Mexican Gothic, we talked a lot about that, right? Shout out to Silvia Moreno Garcia.
I still have to read it.
Always the greatest covers, too. Like,
I saw that there was a new cover.
And then all the international editions look so cool, too. Like,
that looks so badass. Yeah. I think I want to get that one, even though I won't be able to read it. It's like a Japanese version or something. It was really cool.
Right. Oh, actually, that'd be kind of cool, right? Just to have like a collector's edition. People collect toys and figurines, to display. So
I have Spanish, like obviously a bunch of Spanish versions of things, but yeah, I've been wanting to do a little more collecting. Anyway.
Nice. So last episode, we talked a lot about kind of themes, connections. Of course, the history, the fact that's historical.
Yeah, and you were talking about the journey, Richie, like the journey, romanticizing that. I really like the way the story was told. I mean, there's a lot of story It's 363 pages ish. I mean, this is the advanced copy. I don't think it's going to change much. Be a little longer with the end, like
Additional
maps and
added,
stuff.
yeah.
But with that, so it starts, we talked about this last episode, but it starts, with John Riley's story, and then we have Jimena's story separate, and then after a few chapters each, they converge, and then we have chapters with both of them together, and then they get separated again, and then we have separate chapters, and then they come back together at the end. So I really like how there's like this movement, which you alluded again to the ballad, it being like a song between the two. I really like that.
Like a dance with that movement.
Yeah, I really liked that, the way that it was told. And it wasn't, in the beginning, it was a little hard to follow, just because there was so much history and so many names. But I think that's with everything, right? And then once I got a few chapters in, I'm like, okay, I can follow what's happening and who's who and what they're trying to do.
That was kind of going back to our Mexican Gothic episode. I think we had a similar comment that there was a lot of world building first, and it did kind of take the pacing was like that. And I wonder if that's just an element, I guess, of the romance. This big epic journey is that there's this build up, right, and it builds up to finally it ends up on its own momentum.
Is Mexican Gothic a romance?
So Gothic romance, I think it's called.
Oh.
And it's in that term that I was saying the other way, like.
Well, that makes sense.
I mean, there's kind of no spoilers, but go back and check out the episodes, guys.
Yeah, do that.
Yeah, or read the book, Reyna.
But it was a fun read.
Yeah.
But I and a lot of people that I talked to about it mentioned that it kind of had a long startup.
Okay. Is that kind of the same in length as this one?
I don't think it's as long.
I want to say it. I want to say it is.
It is.
I think so.
Not as hard or difficult
To
read.
the beginning for sure was, but when like at the halfway point, I want to say is when I was like I couldn't put it down.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of falling action for sure. Builds up, and the falling action just hits so hard. It's also a mystery though, so it's a little different in that sense where I think there are these elements here that you want to find more about to keep reading. Whereas we know about this kind of battle somewhat, right? And then now we're learning it through the lens of these characters,
Right.
And so, I mean, I think as the reader, we're still invested to see what happens to them, right? Especially Riley being this largely known figure, and Jimena being a fictional one.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And just thinking about like learning about history in this way, making it that much more interesting or engaging.
Yeah.
But then also going back to like, well, how much of this was real, So it would be cool to learn, to have the knowledge that Reyna Grande does about the war, and then to be able to read or write a story like this and like create your own reality within that reality.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's kind of cool.
True.
But if you don't know enough about it, then it's like you're trying to learn about the history while also trying to follow these two fictional characters on their journey. I don't know. It can be a bit much at times, I will admit. I don't know if you guys agree.
I mean, I think the history portions of it were a little bit tougher to get through. But I think I did learn a lot more than I knew about the war. So that was really cool.
Yeah.
And I also really liked the descriptions of the land. I think we were talking about it earlier, Richie, but I don't know, it's like very poetic, and especially towards the end when the thing happens that we're not going to say. No, just kidding.
Oh, you can.
When she goes to Mars.
Would like the end? The
Yeah.
very end?
Yeah, I know. I
She
don't want
goes
to
to
jump. I know.
Mars.
I'm like, okay, and that's the end of the podcast.
So you guys,
No,
I know
I'm just
you didn't
kidding.
think it was science fiction, but they go to Mars at the end. So
No, yeah.
Am I kidding or not? The only way to find out is to read it.
yeah,
But there's like a paragraph towards the end where she's just talking about, I guess, like her favorite spaces in Mexico, and like how she holds it so dear to her, like the land, especially. She doesn't talk a whole lot about the people and the memories that she has there. She talks about like the places that she loved.
yeah. The
So I really
landscape.
like that.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of the romanticizing of the land, Mexico, in particular, right? Because most of this takes place in Mexico. They do talk about Ireland a little bit, and the U.S. a little, but
Yeah.
it's mostly Mexico.
And then I think also it's a lot of in comparison to like when they do talk about Ireland, it's a lot of the time it's John Riley comparing what he's now experiencing in Mexico to his
To what
homeland.
he remembers, yeah.
Right. Have you guys ever been to Ireland?
No.
It's on my.
It's one of my
It's on
destinations for sure.
one day.
I know, one day.
We'll go say hi to Jimenez and Riley's ancestors.
Yeah, I thought you were gonna say we'll have some car bombs.
Oh, no. Oh,
Since we were talking about that earlier, but only
Right,
because of St. Patrick's Day. St. Patrick's Day, St. Patrick's Battalion.
even
I
then,
mean,
like,
so
it's
much.
interesting we started it right around then. Like, that wasn't planned
I know. It's kind of cool.
at first. Yeah,
It
because
all
we had it, like,
aligned.
later on, I think, on our list. And we're like, well, let's move it up here. And then, because I think we were originally going to get this in April. So the fact that we started this near the end of March, like, okay,
Yeah, worked out.
perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah, so talking about the historical element, I do think this semester I was teaching like a class where it's like paired with a history class, and so I ended up in a way teaching like U.S. history. It's so weird. Like I'm gonna have 3 different class preps now, including the history class, and I've never taught history before. I've been a student of, but mostly through literature for so long, right? That's what I've known for so long, grad school, undergrad. But I just know my students' frustrations of like being thrown dates and dates and numbers and
names.
things to memorize, and it just I think that's why historical fiction is so important because it gives like emotional content to these things. And
Yeah.
I think as humans we we recognize that a little bit more. And so I think it's more teachable. So I think
Unless we
that's-
have like a photographic memory, which is very rare anyway, but
Right.
most of us need that extra.
that help. Yeah. Just to have a story behind it, because I think and ultimately, even if we had photographic memory, I just think that we are creatures of stories. We're storytelling beasts. I don't know. That's weird.
Yeah,
I
that
don't know how to
was
say that, but like
odd.
it's what makes us human. It's what connects us. It's stories. Yeah. .com.
odd.com.
.com.
Inside jokes. Awesome.
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about Jimena's character and how, like, the progression, how she's just emerged as such a stronger character in the second half. Not that she wasn't in the beginning, but we're, like, barely getting to know her, and
She experiences a lot of loss.
she experiences this loss, and she kind of is seen, like, victimized, and yeah, I mean, she's left without a husband and stuff, and in those times, and her grandmother, and yeah, so there's all these things that we've kind of feel pity for her, and then she grows as a character. She already knows English, which gives her an advantage, but while she has this relationship with John Riley, she gets much better, more proficient at it. And she's using it to her advantage by the end of the novel, being able to talk to these generales and sergeants and without any shame, she's able to eloquently articulate things that before she wouldn't be able to. So I think just in the language and how she carries herself and the strength that she shows, by the end of the novel makes her like my favorite character. Yeah. What do you think about Jimena?
Yeah, I really liked her character development too. I'm trying to think of a specific moment. I like the way that they teach each other. So like she does learn a lot of the English language that she doesn't know from John Riley. But she's also teaching him about her land and like her traditions. And she's just like kind of showing him a different way of looking at things, I think. I really liked the passage about the nopales.
Yeah.
Page
149 in our copy. I would like to say that it's the same.
Yeah.
No, thanks for mentioning that.
Yeah. True.
Yeah. But towards the bottom of the page, I guess the majority of this page is talking about it, or like different plants. And so then they decide to cook them, the nopales. And then I really liked, so towards the bottom, it says, he had seen this cactus on the coat of arms of the Mexican flag and wondered if it was symbolically what the shamrock was for the Irish. So after he's eating it and he's like trying it, and then he kind of reflects on like how, I guess, symbolic and important this plant is to the Mexican people. And then he kind of tries to relate that emotion to something that he already knows. So I really like that aspect of that.
Yeah.
We're trying to understand what's important to her culture, right? In Mexican culture.
Yeah. I really like that because I think that that's something that more people should try to do, to kind of like...
Imagine.
Yeah. Right. To like understand even if you don't understand. You know?
Yeah,
Well
I
said,
could just
yeah.
drop the mic right there. If we had handheld mics, you could drop it.
Or if they weren't as expensive. But,
Right, yeah.
Don't drop it.
I'm going to buy a cheap mic just for mic dropping. eBay, Craigslist.
That's such a good point. Yeah, and they do in part three is titled "The Eagle and the Shamrock." I don't know if that's part 3.
It was like towards the end of part 2, I want to say.
Okay.
Oh, right. The symbolism of the eagle,
So
right?
there's a lot of that symbolism. So it's kind of foreshadowing already about John Riley's own struggle with being this foreigner, right, in this foreign land, and already being exiled, or at least he felt that way, and a traitor twice over, and trying to assimilate to the Mexican people and Mexican land and stuff. Yeah, so there's a lot of that symbolism there, which I really liked. A lot with the flags too, with the similar colors and their emblems.
Church bells.
Church. Yeah, the Catholicism.
Catholic.
Yes, that. You can tell I'm not religious. Catholicism being what brought them together and kind of a constant throughout the whole novel. The symbolism of the church and how many times they keep coming back to it, Jimena specifically. I really like, again, I know I mentioned this already, but the fact that Jimena is both religious and spiritual, able to bring in her curanderismo too. with John. I almost called him Juan. Well, whatever. She called him Juan,
I
probably.
was doing that earlier. To be fair, maybe it's my fault.
Anyway, little Juanito.
Yeah.
But when John was going through like his PTSD and stuff, and she's trying to give him a limpia
Be the healer.
with the hierbas and the huevo and everything, like basic stuff. And by that, Vanessa, to your point, also teaching him about those ways, right? Like he was like, "Oh, I heard that eggs like absorb bad energy," right? So he knew that already. Like she's teaching him these things too. So I thought that was really cool.
Also, kind of just pointing out like different roles, like big cultural narratives. When we talk about war, they talk a lot about the fighters, the gladiators, they're the champions. But shout out to the healers as well.
I agree. And even Jimena had like this really big couple of chapters with Santa Ana himself and like being his personal healer. And those were really tense chapters, like him trying to like force himself on her and her just like trying like, am I going to get killed if I don't heal him? Like, do I speak my piece with him? Like, what do I say? What do I do? So it was those. I really enjoyed those chapters a lot. They were like, really
And again,
tense.
that's kind of like the bold element of being a writer of historical fiction. You're taking these characters that actually exist and putting them in these scenarios that it's fascinating. It's very bold. I think as a writer, like that would be hard for me to do. Take that and embellish and create these very emotionally tense scenes that are fictional, but I mean, at the same time, they're based out of other people's realities. It's stuff that has happened, people have experienced, and can relate to.
Yeah, that chapter specifically, I think want to stay starting around chapter 24 is the one that really reminded me the most of Mexican Gothic, for sure. When she goes to Doyle's room.
What page is that?
In what particular?
203-ish. Honestly, that whole chapter, it's really just her interaction with Santana Jimenez.
Okay.
But it reminded me of Mexican Gothic when blanking on her name.
In the study with
Not in the study, but when she goes to his bedside before they get married, kind of, and
okay.
like those interactions that she had with the Doyles. Yucky.
No spoilers.
Yeah, I'm like, huh? No, I need to read it. That's on my list for the summer. For show.
And then the following chapter is when I think it's not the first time that they talk about the cockfights, but it's one of the first, or the one where they focus the most on like the details and like what it takes.
That was a pretty cool chapter too.
Yeah.
I think I like this whole section, like the middle section of the book.
And this one he also compares it John Riley also compares it to his own experience with the cockfights in Ireland. So I thought that was kind of cool just to see the different ways that this is seen in different.
I had never realized existed. I never considered that possibility that was a thing in Ireland.
Yeah.
I know it's such a Mexican thing.
Yeah, you associate it. I mean, of course we do because we're also regionally closer. But you hear about it more, even in culture and media and stuff. So again, props to Reyna Grande for again all that research. We learned through Words on a Wire interview that she read a lot, including books just on that. And I think speaking back to like just being the craft of being a writer. It's kind of some of the fun you get to do is you get to research all sorts of interesting topics and become experts on all sorts of different things through your research. And because you want to capture like the reality of it, if you are and you're doing your due diligence, right? And I think that's something I mention all the time to my first year college students or composition students. And it's like, one of the things about being writers, you can research anything, right? And learn more about it. And Could be many roles. So
You're gonna say something else.
Um,
I think we cut you off.
yeah, I don't
I
remember
didn't
what
even
I was.
realize it.
I don't even remember what I was
Sorry.
gonna say. It's okay.
Okay. Just about the cockfights. That
Yeah.
was a really cool chapter.
Well, I had read an article. I can't
Oh.
remember the name of it. But for my anthropology class about the Balinese cockfights,
Oh.
and so it was really interesting, kind of, to see the importance that certain sports, I guess, have in different cultures and the way that they practice them. And yeah, I mean, like in this part, in this chapter specifically, like on 216, we actually see some of them fighting. Like they put them in the little, I guess, ring.
I know, we're trying to imagine.
Yeah. And just the importance that it has, like you have to cut their wings in a specific way so that they can balance themselves. And then sometimes they put like the like not spears, but like what is it? But
The
they're like
metal blade attached to a spur.
yeah.
Oh, right.
Yeah, so that's kind of crazy. And then just kind of seeing they all develop different ways that they fight. So that was kind of cool to see. Like not only the way that the handlers and the trainers are with them, but also to see the way that the roosters themselves kind of develop these practices too. Like
Right,
they just
'cause-
adapt to it.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great.
yeah.
So is that the anthropology class you took this semester?
Yeah. I
Nice.
can't remember who the article was by.
So
But it's in one of my
So there's an
textbooks.
instance though where like even in the book, like something
Right,
you're
yeah.
experiencing is coming into
Connection,
it. See, for me, I just think of Seinfeld. Little Jerry. If you guys know, you know.
You know, you know. Yeah, and it's just kind of like
Oh, okay. It's Deep Play Notes on the Balinese Cockfight by Clifford Geertz.
Oh yeah, Geertz. Huh.
And it's studying the Balinese culture specifically through, I guess, different types of events that they practice and like different things and the way that they interact at like these events rather than specifically.
Deep place. It's talking about like the cultural significance of
Right,
a lot of
yeah.
that's involved.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that comes up a lot too when people protest. A lot of like you see a lot lately with bullfighting in both Spain and Mexico too, right? Because it's you're still thinking about animals for sport like being put against each other. So there's a lot of critiques against that. So, but yeah, I remember reading Clifford Geertz for
Yeah.
sure. I think I used him in some of my literature classes. Some of his research or anything.
Yeah.
On play in particular. Yeah. So cool.
Yeah.
Thanks. I'm glad you remembered that.
Yeah.
I think it's important to note just like the contrast of what we were talking about, like the beauty that Grande shows with how she describes the landscape, but then like the violence and the brutality in like the war and like even things like their entertainment, you know, like cockfights and
That's
stuff.
great.
So I think that's
Yeah.
like, I mean, there's a reason why she was doing that, right? But yeah, that's something that stood out to me a lot.
I mean, do you know, like that's a lot of the entertainment at the time. I think a lot of what entertains us these days too. We can look at with that critical eye for sure. Not to, I don't want to stray too far from that, but yeah.
Yeah. Even thinking about like how the men were treated like animals too, like when they were imprisoned or even John Riley and the other men. I mean, I don't want to give away too much,
Right.
but there's an instance where there's branding, you know, and it's kind of their way, and it really reminded me a little bit of like Inglourious Bastards, where they carve out the
Right.
swastikas.
Wow,
So it's branding on their cheeks with a D for deserter, which just, I mean, if you think about like inhumane practices back then, like of course they would hang people and like flog people and all that kind of stuff, but like the branding just
Not even for deserters. They even did it for like being drunk, like a public drunk.
intoxication.
Yeah, they branded early on, same way, right?
Oh man,
A lot of
imagine
power.
how many people would be
I
branded
mean,
today.
last week Vanessa was talking about Foucault, and I think a lot about power, and the way we assert power through. I mean, his is a lot with like sexuality, but violence comes into play a lot here, and branding is such a huge part of that, and also the dehumanization, right, of being treated like cattle. I couldn't remember the passage I read right now where they were talking about that too, like that branding.
But it was really graphic. I mean, a lot of that's another thing I want to point out about the book is that it's not. And she talked about it on the podcast too, right? Like how it's not a romance novel, and anyone who thinks they're going to come into a romance novel reading this, they're in for
the classic Fabio cover, like romance.
Yeah, because that was before your time.
Do you remember Fabio?
No, but I know the name and like the idea.
If you saw his picture, I actually saw him in California,
Post bird hit
outside of like a Vons. Anyway, I was like, oh my god, it's Fabio, and I tried to get a picture.
It's just like the cliche stereotype of like the big burly man
hair.
with the wide open shirt, revealing his chest, like the long hair in the wind.
Yeah, long hair in the wind and stuff. But
I remember getting hit in the face with a bird on a roller coaster.
Yeah,
Fabio.
Look it up.
Yeah, I don't know why, it was just so funny. Like the dude is like
funny.
the typical romance cover model.
And then get hit.
That's more rom-com.
Like that new movie that just came out with Channing Tatum. It's like the same kind of idea. No,
I'm not familiar with it.
Oh, The Lost City, and he's like
It might be.
a cover model for novels. And
But he doesn't have the long flowy hair.
no, in this movie he does.
Oh, he does? Oh,
Yeah.
Okay, so maybe
it's
he's
based off
he's-
of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. We're getting off topic,
Yeah.
but
I know. I'm sorry.
This is us. We're a pop culture podcast as well. Okay.
we're also a pop culture podcast.
Pretty much.
But yeah, so it's definitely not a romance novel in the traditional sense.
Right.
There's romantic elements, and there's two characters who are romantically involved, but everything else is like the historical fiction, I think, right? But yeah, I think that's what she's also trying to capture here, and she wanted the war not just to be a backdrop, but to be a character of the story, right? She said.
That's right.
And so I really like that, and I think she did achieve that definitely. Now that we're done with the book, I mean, there wasn't a moment where I forgot where they were or what they were dealing with, or that it was just them in love or anything like that. Like, it never happened that way. I was always like, okay, what's going to happen with Santa Ana? Now what's happening with this, and very invested in, like, what was going to happen with them, that I knew it wasn't just them too in the story. Yeah.
And the fact that, again, for the most part, when we're taught Texas history, we don't know a whole lot about it. It's more of like a brief mention or side note.
Yeah.
But you're invested in Jimena, like, and that is one of the things that came up in the podcast as well. That was brought up, but not spoiled, right? Where Jimena is going. It's not Mars. But,
That would be cool.
yeah, I know, right? But, you were talking a lot about her development, and I think a huge part of development is her drive. So without spoiling, like, I want to see what you guys think about, like, why is it she goes that way,
Yeah. Why she decides to.
In terms of her drive, yeah.
Yeah, because she does change. I feel like she's the most three-dimensional character in the novel. Because, again, in the beginning, we see her one way, and then by the end, she's like a completely new person. she has so much agency now. Even though she's with John, I still see her surviving on her own, like whether he had been there or not. And in fact, she's the one who helped him survive.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm curious too, and I think if there's a sequel to this, I would just be curious in seeing like where the story, takes us
Yeah.
It's a great
without
point.
saying too much.
Yeah. And I think even in that Words on Wire interview, she had alluded to maybe even revisiting Jimena at some point,
Yeah,
Yeah.
which is
Yeah.
all right. Cool.
yeah, I really like the character. This character that just came from
The
a
poem.
line in a poem, like that's so rad.
Yeah.
That's so cool. What imagination, huh?
And again, like learning about her more so, right? How Grande filled in a lot of her own experiences in life
Yeah.
to create Jimena. I think only says that there's much more on the way.
Right. Just a lot to say.
Yeah, it's great.
And it did take her, like 7 years to complete this novel.
Something like that,
which
yeah.
makes sense, right? 'Cause she kept coming back to it, and she wrote like a couple of other books in between.
Some nonfiction, different genres.
And did more research, wrote a little bit more. And so I think that that's also really cool to hear authors talk about that it's not something that you have to sit, work on it, and finish it. You can come back to it. And maybe later on you'll have a different or fresh perspective, lived a little, have more experience, whatever it is you need to do, but you don't have to, okay, I'm going to set aside 6 months to write my poetry collection and then do it. Like, that's really hard to do.
Do that to themselves, and then they get too anxious. And this is a running theme because this did come up with Kylie, for example, right? How Woman of Light, her upcoming book, and she's been writing for a while. I think it was her first project, if I remember. I don't know, maybe I'm misremembering. Like she, but it's been working on it for a while. Kuwatli Girl, that one took a while for her to come out with too, and it's stories from. So like I think that's great. So if you're listening to this for the first time and hadn't heard this from our discussions on those previous authors, like just take your time. The story needs to unravel, unfold, develop, and trust in your craft, but don't give up.
Yeah. And it'll unravel on its own. It's not something that we can set time frames or timelines on. I mean, maybe later on when you get published and your publisher's like, okay, you have a year to write this new one, then maybe you have a deadline.
Story, for sure.
Yeah.
But, this is your first go around, take your time. Your story will get told and we'll be more than happy to read it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then we'll talk about it on the podcast.
Yeah. Exciting stuff.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of Literally Literary, recorded at Power at the Pass and brought to you by Border Census. This episode, we continued our discussion on A Ballad of Love and Glory by Reyna Grande. If you haven't read it, we hope we inspire you to pick up a copy. Follow us on Instagram at literallyliterary.ep and on Twitter at literallylitep.